Oh, I got it.
Avoid doing the meetings on Sundays, so you're like,
All right, everyone. In the interest of time, now I know people are going to be filtering in because of the end of the class period, but we'll go ahead and start now because I have a number of announcements to make. We also have a lot of folks who are joining us this afternoon via live stream. And I did want to mention that because we have folks from California, New York, Arkansas, Mississippi, the Panhandle from Florida who are joining us via live stream. So we'll go ahead and get started now. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedules today. Thank you so much to our student panelists for taking time out of their very successful midterm exam time period to be here with us. Now is a good time. If you have cell phones or other devices that make noise, go ahead and silence them, put them on a quiet mode or airplane mode or what have you. And really, welcome to all. This is our 12th annual Mississippi Freedom Project student panel. Every summer we travel to the Mississippi Delta. This summer we also jumped across the river, in a manner of speaking, to do oral histories in the Arkansas Delta. We were asked to come and help commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Elaine Massacre, which was an anti-black pogrom that took place during Red Summer in 1919. And we're going to hear about that this summer. Before we start, though, I do want to, there's a lot of people here already who I could acknowledge, but I do want to acknowledge a dear friend of mine, a fellow military veteran, who has helped us so much on this trip over the last several years. On our way out to the Mississippi Delta, we always stop in the Panhandle. And for years we stopped in Tallahassee to actually spend a day with Mrs. Laura and Mr. Samuel Dixie, who were icons in the civil rights movement in Leon County, Florida. In fact, Laura Dixie was called the mother of the movement in Tallahassee. She was a person that I interviewed as a graduate student in 1994. And in ensuing years, she adopted so many of our students from the University of Florida, we just decided to just stop and spend a day with her on our way to the Mississippi Delta. But in the process of doing that, we also made another dear friend, Mr. John Nelson. And I wanted to just say a few words about Mr. Nelson because he drove all the way down from Jefferson County, Monticello, to be with us this morning. Mr. Nelson is, as I mentioned, a U.S. military veteran. He's past post commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars Lodge in Monticello, Jefferson County. And he has so many firsts on his resume, we could spend the entire hour giving you all those firsts. But I wanted to acknowledge him really this morning in his capacity as a friend of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, because he has helped us set up and conduct more than, actually the number I think now, Mr. Nelson, is about 40 oral history interviews with African American military veterans. And so I wanted to take this time to acknowledge you this morning. Thank you, sir. And by the way, Mr. Nelson's a good person to have as a friend because every time we stop in Jefferson County, as the students can tell you, he makes sure that we're well fed. We have a full banquet breakfast, so that's very much appreciated in that long road trip. I also wanted to take just a couple minutes for you students. Oh, yes, sir. Oh, yeah, Dr. Lasson, also I want to acknowledge you, sir. Thank you. Thanks for being here with us. And he made the drive down. If you're a student, the oral history program supports a number of courses per semester, and there are flyers on the table. So as you're on your way out and you're looking for really cool classes to take, please check into those classes. I was also asked to make space for a special announcement, of which I have no idea what that announcement is. But as I'm doing that, I also want to give us a save the date. And so we have just announced, you may know this, that the University of Florida's African American Studies program is in the midst of celebrating our 50th anniversary, our 50th birthday, if you will. And we have just set a date for our 50th Anniversary Symposium, which will be held Thursday, February 20th. And it will be, part of it will be at Smathers Library East. The other part of it will be in our brand new Institute of Black Culture, rebuilt Institute IBC. And that's going to be a really cool event. It's going to be an international symposium. It's going to be a one-day event. I'm chairing the symposium committee. We're going to try to build on the success that we had last March for our 3-day African American History Symposium. So save the date, February 20th. The very next day, that Friday, February 21st, another cool save the date thing is that we're going to be dedicating a marker on Turlington Plaza, which is dedicated to the 50th anniversary of African American Studies. And those of you who are in the program know that the faculty are moving over to Turlington. Their offices will be actually facing out towards the plaza. So African American Studies, thanks to decades of student struggle, faculty struggle, staff energy and struggle, is actually moving to a center part of the University of Florida. So we want to have you come out and commemorate that with us. The announcement, Deborah, are you making the announcement? And this is a surprise.
Don't go anywhere.
Okay. Dr. Ortiz, on behalf of all the staff, we wanted to acknowledge you with it being today National Bosses Day. And we all just wanted to thank you for your support and service and helping us at the program. This is your card. Don't open your card.
Okay,
right
all right.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thanks,
Okay.
Dr. Ortiz.
Okay. But wait, there's more. There's more, and it's coming up the aisle. Today is National Bosses Day, and we would like to honor Tamara Jenkins for all her work. And also, you get some flowers too. And
Yes.
Now I get to take the mic. Thank you. So cool. Tamara Jenkins is the hardest working, most effective office manager in this campus and probably in the universe. And Deborah Hendricks, so please give them a round of applause. We could not do the Mississippi Freedom Project trip without Tamara Jenkins, and Tamara is the person who makes the reservations, keeps us connected to community contacts, reserves the vans, everything down to the final details. Thank you. So I was asked to just say a few words, and I will try to be as brief as I can to talk about the history of the Mississippi Freedom Project. Of course, when you ask a history professor to be brief, it's kind of dangerous, right? But I will try to be brief. I mentioned earlier I started doing oral history work in the Deep South in the early 1990s. I was a grad student at Duke University. And the first summer I was out in the Mississippi Delta actually was the summer of 1995, a summer that I will never forget. And I was working as a research assistant for a project supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities called Behind the Veil, documenting African American life in the Jim Crow South. And we ended up doing nearly 2,000 oral history interviews with African American elders who came of age during the high tide of the Jim Crow period. So these were people, I think the oldest person I interviewed over those 4 or 5 years of summer field work was 104 years old. Otto Gainey was here in Gainesville, Florida. Some of you may remember Mr. Gainey. He was a World War I veteran, and I actually interviewed Mr. Gainey, and I think he was actually 104 years old when I interviewed him. And so that was a really amazing experience for me, to be in the Delta, to be well away from any campus or any university. And so I wanted to be able to replicate that experience of deprivation and hardship and excitement for my students. So that's why we go back to the Mississippi Delta. But seriously, it was eye-opening to me to be in a place that I had read about that's in the history books, but that very few historians from academia actually go. And as I traveled around the world, as Mr. Nelson can vouch for this, as we went overseas as military, as soldiers, insofar as a lot of people throughout the world know American culture, they learn about us through the Mississippi Delta. They learn about us through people like Bo Diddley, Elvis Aaron Presley, blues, jazz, rock and roll. And all of that comes from the civil rights movement. In more recent decades, they learn about the best this country has to offer from learning about the civil rights movement, the Black freedom struggle. And again, was anchored, and is anchored in the Mississippi Delta. It's Fannie Lou Hamer. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired, right? It's the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It's Robert Moses and Mississippi Freedom Summer. So what I wanted to do as a professor was to be able to get my students to the Delta to do oral history interviews with incredibly resilient people who, against all odds, have done more to help bring democracy to the United States than I think any other group of people that I've studied. And that's what I do, is I study social movements. And so the year before I arrived here, I actually started talking with people. A person in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Development office called me and said, Professor Ortiz, is there a project you think our donors would be interested in supporting? And that's when we put together the idea for the Mississippi Freedom Project. I had been going out and doing oral history interviews myself individually with movement veterans for many years in towns like Itta-Bena, Greenwood, LaFleur County, Indianola, so on and so forth. But I was thinking, man, I'm only one person. What if I could get a team of hardworking, unpaid workers out there doing an interview, helping me? We could multiply, right? And there have been many amazing events over the years. I'll just mention one or two. One was we worked for a number of years with the Sunflower County Civil Rights Project, and actually produced a booklet that of oral history interviews with Freedom Summer volunteers and local people who had sacrificed so much and were the keys behind the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, 1964 and 1965. These were the activists that made those acts possible. They were the ones who were beaten, arrested. They had loved ones that they saw murdered. One in broad daylight, and a shocking daylight murder, actually, that was committed by a state representative. And so we were able to document those stories, create a booklet for the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. And we presented it to the veterans of Freedom Summer from Sunflower County, Mississippi, and they had tears in their eyes. There was an incredible event, incredibly educational for our students. I'll conclude by talking just briefly about this year's trip. This year's trip was incredibly memorable. You're going to hear why in a few moments. I don't like to rank each year's cohort of students who make the trip to the Delta. This group was, I think, the finest, or among the finest. I better say that because we have live stream. We have our alumni listening in, right? So among the finest, I'll say it. They were incredible. We get up every morning, usually up by 6, if not earlier, and we often work until 10 or 11 p.m., sometimes as late as midnight. So it's a really hard-working trip in terms of doing interviews, taking photographs, doing a video, a documentary. I want to end in kind of a somber note, but it points out the importance of history and why we say history is no longer an elective. In this society, it's a matter of life or death. So 2 weeks before literally 2 weeks before we traveled to Glendora, Mississippi, which is the site of the Emmett Till Museum. A lot of Emmett Till's people still live in Glendora, and we have the opportunity to spend a day with them. No more than 2 weeks before we traveled to Glendora, a group of vandals, some of them actually, turns out from the University of Mississippi, went and destroyed a number of civil rights markers that were dedicated to the memory of Emmett Till. The media reported on one marker that was destroyed, and that got national coverage, but others were destroyed as well. Now, on the back end of the trip, I mentioned that we were in Elaine, Arkansas to help commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Elaine Massacre. And this was a horrific anti-black massacre where literally hundreds of black farmers, landowners, were driven off their land. Many were murdered. Many actually were murdered by federal troops. And then that land was seized by wealthy plantation owners and land interests from New York and Chicago. And so we're asked to help kind of put this commemoration together. 3 years ago, the people of Elaine, population 650 people, created a beautiful living memorial to honor the memory of the victims of that massacre. And they planted a weeping willow tree. Well, you're familiar with willow trees, they grow just incredibly. And they put up markers to commemorate the massacre. And we took video footage of that. We interviewed people about that marker and what it meant to people in Elaine to have that marker and the memory and the meaning of struggle today. You know, this isn't just something that happened in the past, it's something that animates people's desire to make a better life for their children today and for tomorrow. No more than 3 or maybe 4 days after we left Elaine, vandals came in the dead of night, cut down the willow tree, and destroyed that, the Elaine monument. This is why we say, brothers and sisters, history is no longer an elective, it's a matter of life or death. To paraphrase a famous Delta activist, there are mean things happening in this land. And there's so many things we can learn from people in the Mississippi Delta, and that's why our students go there year after year after year. And I'll conclude with the fact that the footage that we took, the video footage, the still photographs of that memorial in Elaine, Arkansas, we ended up sharing with USA Today, because USA Today did a story about that, and it was the imagery that we had taken that actually went into that story. We had no idea. Of course, we were shocked as well as anyone else. But at this point, I want to again thank you for attending the panel this morning, and I want to turn the microphone over to this coming year's, I should say, next year's coordinator of the Mississippi Freedom Project, Omar Sanchez. And before I hand him the mic, I'll mention that he's also produced for us a wonderful Mississippi Freedom Project booklet. Now, if you haven't got the booklet, please pick one up on your way out. If you're live streaming in and you have supported the program in any way, shape, or form, you're alumna of the program, you're a donor of the program, thank you so much. We're going to get this to you. This is a booklet of student reflections. And you'll hear some of these reflections today, but they're kind of more extensively produced in the book. So again, thank you for your support. And I'm going to turn the mic over to Mr. Omar Sanchez. Thank you.
It's on my page. Hey everyone, I'm very excited to present this with my fellow panelists because I really enjoyed my time hanging out for a week in that van every hour of the day with them. Like, I really loved it. And I've been working on this for a long time, so I'm excited for it to be presented and for it to be over, honestly. But so today I'm gonna have each panelist talk about a different place we went. Sometimes there'll be 2 panelists, and we just want you to experience the experience that we had and understand why we went on this trip and what it meant for us to go on this trip. So I hope you enjoy it. So first, Megan Pitt's gonna talk about Monticello.
Hello, everyone. So our first stop on the trip was in Monticello in Florida, and it was a good introduction into oral history. Some people, students who hadn't practiced oral history interviews, did it for the first time, and this was at the Veterans of Foreign Wars chapter in Monticello, specifically with African American veterans. And it was a great experience because, each veteran had a different story, so I don't know the stories that were told to my colleagues, but for mine, they went to the Korean War and Vietnam, so it was interesting to hear their perspective and how they were treated there by the people at the time. It was an experience, and we learned a lot about how we have to prepare for these interviews in order to provide the most in-depth questions that can get the most out of the history of the time. And do you have anything else to add to that?
Anybody?
Monticello?
So the next place we went was Montgomery, Alabama. So at Montgomery, we actually went to the Equal Justice Initiative Museum, which if you haven't went, I would really encourage you to go because it's heartbreaking to see the struggles and how it's continued through the centuries and it's still continuing now. We went to the Equal Justice Initiative Museum and we went to the Lynching Memorial, which it's almost unreal because we here at Samuel Proctor we talk about lynchings, but it's different when you see these monuments there with these names. I have some from my own county. I'm sure some of them found them as well, and it's completely heartbreaking. So talking about this would be Sarah Lewis and Aishwarya Kunta.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah, and when I had the opportunity to go to Montgomery, Alabama, as Omar said, it was absolutely shocking to be confronted with the history, the pain of this country as soon as you walk into the Legacy Center. So what I starkly remember is seeing that you are standing on the ground of where people were auctioned off. It was at the slave auction house. Like you see those letters when you walk in, or those words when you walk in. And I just remember crying as I walked through the museum because you got an in-close experience of what it was like to be in a slave auction pen and be holding and not have your family member because you're separated and you're sold into slavery. You're a human being that is now property, and you're confronted with this history that wasn't taught to me in high school when I was taking American history courses. And seeing the memorial and seeing that even in my outside of my own hometown of Orlando in Ocoee, Florida, there was lynching that occurred for Black people that wanted to vote was something that shocked me. And it was just an experience like any other. It was painful, but it was necessary for healing. And Brian Stevenson, who is one of the directors and founders of the Equal Justice Initiative, talks about that a lot, that we have to be confronted with our painful history in order to heal and to move forward. And being a part of the Mississippi Freedom Project did help me confront this history. Aishwarya.
Yes, so the Equal Justice Initiative Museum was actually one of my favorite parts of the entire trip because I'm a history major here at University of Florida, so almost every class I walk into, the first thing we do is cover slavery and the history of slavery. So then going to this museum, like not only did it go through a lot of the lessons that I've learned in the past, but it was written out in a way that I've just never seen before. You walk in and there was this timeline on the floor. It was a whole room of just a timeline. And then you see specific events that happen throughout history and you notice the continuation of what's happening. And then you see how it manifests today. And you realize a lot of these injustices are even continuing today. So the museum itself was a very powerful experience. And then when you finally walk into the lynching memorial itself, the way it's organized, it gives you chills when you walk in because the pillars are literally hanging, and when you look up you just see like countless names and you realize that each of these pillars are not just a county, they're made up of multiple people. So it really puts into perspective of not just how it affected the Delta or some like foreign thing that we study about, but how it affected our own communities. I found Ocoee, Florida, like where I'm from, and there were countless names, not just names, but some of them were unknown. And you realize a lot of this work is still happening, and a lot of what we're doing, like what we were like recording the interviews, talking to the people, like all of that is significant because it unravels a lot of the stories that we still don't know a lot about.
One more thing I'd like to add about being on Montgomery, Alabama is that we both had the opportunity, along with Megan, to meet someone who is unjustly incarcerated. His name is Cantrell Jackson. At 14 years old, he was imprisoned falsely, and he spent 10 or 15 years, 14 years in prison for no reason, and was released. And we had the opportunity to meet him and hear his story, and he was actually featured in one of the exhibits at the Legacy Center. And that was shocking to me, but also puts into perspective how just about anyone you know, including my older brother, a black male who is 21 years old, could be falsely imprisoned for something that you did not do. So it made everything seem more real, and more painful as well, too.
To that. It also showed that history is still in the making right now, and that was a lot of what Equal Justice Initiative focused on, is that things are happening right now, and they have been translated from the past into different forms, and right now that form takes the place of in the criminal justice system and the injustices that have legacies that follow from slavery and segregation. What she just talked about, Cantrell Jackson, his court case was Jackson v. Hobbs, and it was in 2012, and it was regarding sentencing juveniles to life without parole. And the precedent this set was that it was unconstitutional for mandatory life without parole for minors. And this was definitely a success for juvenile justice everywhere, but to hear Cantrell's story and his dedication and to enlightening other people just in the museum walking around was really powerful.
The last thing I want to say about Montgomery is the lynching memorials. The one thing that I like that they did is that you can't just get your monument back unless you do a Truth and Reconciliation project. Until those counties are ready to accept that they wrongfully lynch these people, they can't have their memorials back. And if they just want it back for clout or something, no, it's not good enough. You need to understand what you did was wrong. So that's the last thing I want to say about Monticello and the lynching memorial. So next we went to Natchez, and Sarah is going to talk again, and Aishwarya is going to talk again.
All right, it's me, Sarah, again. I'm back on the mic. So in Natchez, Mississippi, we were there for 2 or 3 days, and we had Jeremy, what was his last name again? Our tour guide was Jeremy, and he took us through Natchez, which was one of the biggest slave markets at the Fork of the Roads in the late 1800s, of course. 1800s. And to me, what was great about this experience is that I not only got to help give one of my first interviews with Dr. Ortiz and Miss Deborah Hendricks, but I also got to learn about the history. We visited the local NAACP home back from the 1900s, and Aishwarya and I got to interview Miss Doris Drake. And for me, as a current member of the Gator chapter of the NAACP here on this campus, it was very fascinating to hear the perspective of a secretary who was actually involved in the movement in the 20th century, talking about the racism that she endured and the pain that she also endured. I remember Ms. Drake was speaking during our interview and was near tears just because of the impact of dealing with racism that she dealt with. And she just felt so much pain and talked about how in today's age, it's very important for us young individuals to not only be informed, but also to use our power to vote. And considering that we are coming up upon an election year, I do encourage you all to be registered to vote and understand who you're voting for and who aligns with your beliefs.
We actually spent the longest amount of time in Natchez. And one thing that Jeremy mentioned that was really interesting was Natchez was really famous for antebellum tourism. So a lot of people around the world will come here and they'll visit all the big, beautiful plantation homes and stuff. And Jeremy started his company on almost like the counter history of that and exposing what happened with the slave markets and how people were traded and what it meant for the Black history in that town. So his whole tour was just so interesting because just the existence of itself was a very strong indicator of resistance, right? Also about Miss Doris Drake, she was such an amazing person to interview. she was literally on the front lines of the civil rights movement. Actually, she was known as she was an icebreaker. So what icebreakers do is they'll go into areas that are still segregated, and they just go and enjoy the service there that they're supposed to provide. So she was telling us about a time when they went to like the white side of town, and they went to a restaurant that usually Black people are not allowed in, and all they would do is sit and they would eat, and then they would continue on with their day. And just that story was so powerful because she talked about how like the discrimination they experienced just for a meal. And so, and like hearing her, like she was 14, or no, she was about to graduate high school at that time. And just hearing her experience as a young person going through that time, experiencing having such a different experience than what I ever had in high school was just so interesting to hear.
So what I can say about Natchez is I don't want you all to think that we just go there for oral history. We did have a day of community service, which we gave back. So I know half of all y'all went to the soup kitchen. Okay, they went to the soup kitchen. I went outside and I was cutting grass. So there was an African American cemetery that went into disrepair, and the city no longer pays for it to be cleaned up at all. So there was this woman named Miss Dorothy who goes there every weekend and cuts grass. And she's an older woman. She's probably in her 70s. So imagine her cutting grass every weekend by herself just to keep this cemetery looking clean, looking nice, paying respect to these people who have died. So I know me and Aishwarya and I think Megan went out there and Julian. We went out there and we cut grass for a couple hours, and Mrs. Dorothy was like the coolest person ever. I can tell you that. She was amazing, and it's sad because we haven't interviewed her because we've only been able to talk to her because of community service, but we were glad to go out there and do that for them because no one else is doing it for them, and it's disrespectful. That's just it. Like, I understand how you can let a cemetery go disrepair because there was a white cemetery right next to it. It's totally clean. So I don't understand what happened there. So following that, so we're gonna go to Glendora. So I'm pretty sure all of you've heard of Glendora. It's where Emmett Till was murdered. And I want to say murdered because a lot of people don't want to say that. So talking about this is going to be Amanda and Alvin.
Hello, everyone. I actually didn't know about Glendora until the trip. I knew a little bit about Emmett Till and that he was murdered, but I always heard about Money, Mississippi, and not specifically Glendora. We did a tour, a bus tour with Mayor Thomas, and it was just very touching and moving, and definitely a lot of crying, and then just a lot of reflection. But going there, just the overall atmosphere, the environment, it definitely shifted. Again, like the historical marker for Emmett Till, it was destroyed. Just like Mayor Tom was just explaining that like this town is always like trying to cover up like the murder of Emmett Till, and no one wants to really talk about it. And I often hear that when some people will say like, oh, in order us to move on, like we have to like, ignore it or just like not talk about it. But you can't heal a wound when you don't attend to it. And this is a very touching subject and it's hard. But at the end of the day, we need to find a way to talk about it because you had Emmett Till to Trayvon Martin. So that historical like connection, it continues to this day in 2019. Just like my overall experience in Glendora, in a way it was like traumatizing, just a lot of reflection because I learn about the history here at University of Florida. I learn about Black history. But when you go there physically to the place when it occurred, it's another type of experience. Definitely a lot of emotions for me, just very touching. I had a great time, but just being there, it made me reflect because I do have younger and older brothers, and just to see how Emmett Till was treated and they tried to cover it, and overall knowing that Glendora is, when you talk about Emmett Till, at least from my perspective, Glendora was never mentioned, is never really talked about, and Glendora as a city played a huge part when Emmett Till was murdered.
Yes, also to add from my perspective, I would definitely say the atmosphere kind of changed when we entered that area. I mean, first of all, it's like kind of like an agricultural area, so large corn and soy fields, and once in a while you see a beautiful, rich, kind of fancy plantation house. And when in stark or strong contrast to this, you have a community like Glendora, and you definitely feel that some history where has not been reconciled or processed yet, and you feel that when talking to people, when just walking in the street or through the community. And I really experienced for myself that's something that's kind of impacting people a lot, to have this unprocessed history or heritage within them. And on the other side, it was very powerful to see how strongly people work to kind of create a memorial, despite any kind of backslash they face from other entities, and how engaged people are in this field. It was sometimes confusing to see that there's different groups working not necessarily alongside each other, but trying to create, I would assume, different versions of a memorial and telling the story maybe in more way. So that was surprising to see from my perspective.
To add on to what occurred, like what we experienced in Glendora, everyone mentioned that the vibe completely changed as soon as you entered. The town is very decrepit, dilapidated, and filled with poverty. And Mayor Thomas took us throughout different sites relating to the death of Emmett Till. So we got to visit Brian's store where Emmett Till was alleged to have whistled at a white woman, which led to his death. And I couldn't help but feel so much pain, but also empowerment to know that so many people are working so hard to make sure that his story is properly being told and addressed. And it was horrible what was done to that child. He wasn't a man, he was a child, 14 years old. And the legacy, as Amanda mentioned, that lives on today with the death of Trayvon Martin occurring in 2012 still affects me too, because I was 12 years old and having to hear about someone that could have been my brother being murdered, and then learning about that history as well and seeing it in person was painful. But it was necessary to, of course, address that healing.
So next we're talking about Elaine. So I didn't know about Elaine until I actually went on a trip. So Elaine's where there was a massacre. It's called the Elaine Massacre. It's more commonly known as the Elaine race riots. There's a distinction though. They always say race riots because they imply that it's violence on both sides. That's not true. There's violence on one side on the African American community. So for this section, I actually will be talking about it in Julian, but I'll let Julian go first.
All right. Hi, y'all. My name is Julian Valdivia. I'm a historian at the University of Florida, undergraduate history major. I like to think of myself as a historian. And I think that when we talk about history, and particularly the history of the civil rights movement, a lot of people assume that it's something that has been reconciled, that after Brown v. Board, after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that by the 1960s, Americans had made up with each other over the issue of race relations in the country. But I think Elaine stands in stark contrast to that, about how this stuff is still ongoing and in no way ended in the 1960s. And I think nothing reminded me more of that than when I interviewed a black farmer named Lawrence Manfield. And I want to preface this story by saying that when historians talk about history, they like to say a quote that says, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes often." In Elaine, it echoes, and it's especially true with this story. So Mr. Mansfield was a farmer, and in the 1980s, if most of you know, farmers receive most of the funding for their seeds and for their capital, their machinery, through loan programs, particularly through the federal government with the FHA. And the loan officer in the area was a diehard segregationist. And essentially what he did was he delayed the time at which black farmers, Mr. Mansfield included, received their FHA loans. And what this did was that by receiving his loans later in the year, months later, he and many other black farmers weren't able to plant their crops when they needed to be planted. And so by the time that harvest was ready, either the crops wouldn't be grown or they wouldn't be grown enough to a point to where it's efficient. And after years of this, black farmers were essentially run out of business, and they had to sell their land to predominantly white landowners. And I say that it echoes in Elaine because the Elaine Massacre happened, or when the Elaine Massacre happened, individuals, particularly white individuals, bought up the land that African Americans had formerly inhabited and called their home. And in the 1980s, again, you have black farmers being run off their own land so that it can be purchased by white land or by black or white plantation owners. And so, again, you just see these stories continually repeat over and over and over again. And Elaine is really a reminder that this stuff didn't stop in the 1960s. It didn't stop in the 1980s. And we're still really reconciling with this today. So that's what impacted me the most with Elaine. I don't know if Omar has more to add.
Yeah, so I actually want to talk about an interview I did. So I did an interview with this man named Minister Zucara, also known as Sweet Willie Wine. So, Sweet Willie Wine was a civil rights activist who was notorious in 3 states. He was known as someone who can get the young people together and go out there and protest and do demonstrations. But I bet none of y'all have heard of him before today. So that was the wild thing to me. That I met some man who's done so much for the civil rights movement, but I didn't know his name until I met him. And it's just stories like that are always being found. But I like to say like this. The history we learn in our textbook isn't enough. We do this because there's so much more we have to learn. And I would not have met Sweet Willie Wine. And I'm going to tell you, he was my favorite interview of all time. Like, he was the coolest guy. I talked to him for 2 hours. Imagine talking to someone for 2 hours. Like, that's someone I didn't even know. Talking for 2 hours. And I think there's a picture up there, too. But it'll come in a minute. But his story was amazing. He was incarcerated from a young age. And he got out of that just to join the civil rights movement. And literally, I just don't understand how we don't know about him. That was just my main problem with this, that we don't know about people like him. I've talked to other civil rights activists, and I feel bad because their name escapes me, but that history shouldn't be forgotten. So the last part I want to talk about is Atlanta, which was our final stop, and then the car ride, what we learned from each other, our experiences. So I will be talking again, and then Alvin's going to be talking.
So maybe let me start with Atlanta. So that was our final stop, and we went to the Civil Rights Museum. Yes, and I think it was perfectly placed right at the end to kind of get like a summary or a bigger picture about civil rights issue in the US, but also the global perspective. Because, for example, the exhibition also featured things happening in China, Korea, or Germany, and it was as Julian said, sometimes it seems like history keeps repeating itself, but it's definitely not always in the same way. And it's also very good to see, or like inspiring to see that we, in some ways, hopefully learn from past mistakes that we did, so that history does not exactly repeat itself in the future. And what was also very insightful to kind of experience was that a museum in Atlanta can give you a very good overview about what happened in the US, but it cannot tell like all the small, local, but still very important stories, like in Glendora or Natchez. And that's something you can only experience by actually going where and talking to people and taking your time. And yeah, to see the contrast between the two, that was very powerful. And do you want to say something to Atlanta first and then?
So at Atlanta, I cried. So it was very powerful. I feel like it was a great conclusion to our trip, but I feel like you don't appreciate civil rights history until you go to the Civil Rights Museum. Because it's like, you see all the people who were murdered. You see all the people who fought for the rights that we have today. But it's like, you don't appreciate it until you go there and you understand that. And like, yeah, it doesn't have everyone included, but it was still so powerful. Like, I cried like twice, I'm not gonna lie. Like, seeing people die just protecting their grandfather, their mother from white terrorists, honestly. That was moving. And it's just like, you don't appreciate it until you go somewhere like this and you go on a trip like this and you see it real life. So I really recommend the Civil Rights Museum. It was a great place and it was a great conclusion to our trip. I'll let Alvin go on, or does anyone else want to talk about Atlanta?
I just wanted to say about the museum in Atlanta, like in the beginning of the tour, there was an option to do like a interactive sit-in. So they'll put your headphones on, the headphones on, and then you had to place your hands on the counter and you're pretty much put you in a place as if you're doing a sit-in. And I'm thinking, oh, I can do this. I'm just gonna listen. But the things that were being said, it was as if I was actually there. Like, that's the closest that I've been in a sit-in, even though I was physically not there. And it made me realize how much strength and resistance that you really had to have when like Black people were doing resistance, the sit-ins, they couldn't resist. And it's like, it took a lot of power for them not to do anything, because I'm thinking to myself, I'm sitting here and I'm getting all like hyped up, like I want to do something. So it kind of just really made me appreciate Black people even more, that they had the courage to do that, because, you know, like the way the voices that they did within the headphones is like, you know, people whispering and then, you know, people saying these things, and it was like, how can you not react? But they didn't. And I really love that part of the museum.
Amanda said said what I wanted to discuss, but I think when you have the headphones on and you're in the Civil Justice Legacy Center, you hear like the N-word in your ear. You hear like, you imagine coffee being poured down your back, and yes, it's painful, but it's also empowering, and that's all I want to add to what Amanda had to say.
And all I want to add to that is that you even have a timer, like the high score of how long you can last, which is sad, but I was only there for 1 minute 11 seconds, and it was like I thought it was like 10 minutes, and it felt horrible. I was really sad. So me and Al are gonna talk about the car ride. Y'all can all pitch in. We all had fun.
Yeah, so maybe a little bit about my background, because I just moved to the US a year ago, and originally from Germany, and I study agriculture engineering, so I'm relatively new to the US, but also wasn't very new to the field of history, of particularly oral history, and except for New York and Gainesville, I haven't seen much of the US before going on that trip. So in this, it was, I really want to say, a very holistic and extremely valuable learning experience to be on this trip and also to share it with my fellow colleagues. It was great to have kind of this network to also talk and process like the experiences from the day and the evening, because it was sometimes very heavy, like emotionally heavy experiences that I made, and I think that all of us made. And besides, let's say, oral history or the civil rights movement, I think I've learned a lot about like just U.S. culture in general, just by spending so much time in a car with other people who grew up in the U.S. Really gave me a better, I think, kind of understanding of also current issues regarding gender or identity, which are sometimes, for me as an outsider, a bit harder to understand. And so it was great to hear what other people experienced growing up in the US. And I think that's definitely something I'll take home when I go back to Germany, those kind of insights and like a better understanding of civil rights history in the US, what it meant on a like global or large scale level, but also on a very local scale in specific areas and specific towns, and how it is connected to the US right now. Yeah.
You want to talk about the car ride experience? We all had different cars. Just talk about your experience.
Okay. With my car ride, I think no, they're not here. Oh, well, Miss Deborah, hey. My car ride, most of us, like, we were quiet, and honestly, it's because we were just debriefing the whole process from, like, each city and each museum that we visited. So, like, we did talk about our experience and how we reacted and what we thought about certain things, but honestly, for the most of it, like, the people that were in my car specifically, we just did a lot of, like, soul searching and just, alone and just debriefing it. Just on ourselves. And like for me, I'm the type of person that like before I like talk to other people about certain things, I just like to take the time, within myself to really think and debrief it like within my own time and space, because everyone takes in different things at different times. So, I mean, my car ride was nice. Deborah, you're the best.
One thing that was really amazing about the car rides is each person is from a very different background. So, and I was really amazed by the willingness of everybody to contribute their own experiences. People spoke very openly about how they were experiencing everything that we saw on the trip and how that related to a lot of things that they've learned in the past. So we really got to like deconstruct even like our own notions of what we've thought all our lives and things like that. So it was a really intense experience, especially because you spent like 10 hours with everyone doing a lot of this.
Yeah, as Aishwarya kind of mentioned and Alvin, it was a good time to process everything we were learning and then analyze how race impacts each of us differently and at different times in our life, and how we react to that and what we do with the knowledge we gain from talking about these issues and going to the sites. Processing with everyone was partly draining, but definitely helpful in thinking forward into the future.
So the car rides weren't all just processing everything. They were fun too, and you got to learn a little bit about everyone. So as Alvin mentioned, like you got to experience American culture. So we pulled up into a Sonic before going into Glendora, Mississippi, and he was like a 5-year-old. He's like, "Oh my God, what do I order?" And it was so exciting to be there to experience his first time having Sonic, like having hamburgers and things like that. That was really cool. And what I loved also is that you got to learn about everyone. So I'll just speak a little bit about everyone here. So Julian is from Fort Myers, and this man has so much passion for Fort Myers, and I didn't even know Fort Myers existed. I'm from Orlando. And when I go down south, I go to Miami to visit my grandmother in Little Haiti, and that's it. And then, of course, I just spoke about Alvin, but Aishwarya we went to the same high school, and just to get to meet her and like talk to her about like her experiences at Olympia was so interesting because like we had different experiences. We were both in like similar programs, but she's an amazing individual, and I just love talking to her. Amanda is so full of light and is so funny, and we're both Haitian American, and just to hear her experiences like have helped make me a better person. And of course, Megan is amazing. She has such a love and passion for law and history, and she's a boss. Omar, he can do it all. Omar, let me correct myself, I'm sorry. He can do it all. He's amazing too. We went to a social justice retreat together, Gatorship, in March, and then to just be on the MFP project with him was also amazing because he's so well-read and he gives so much perspective. And I think when you go on an intensive trip like this and you learn about history, you also learn about people, and that's important because we are interviewing people, and it makes everything more real and more personal. So that my car ride was amazing.
Okay, I just want to speak on Sarah because this is my first time meeting Sarah, and she blew me away. I was like, she's an amazing person, well-spoken. She knows a lot about history. So every time I talk to her, like, she makes me want to better myself in a positive way. And just coming from the same Haitian background, I'm just like, wow, like woman empowerment. So you're also amazing and beautiful person inside and out.
So I just want to say one more thing about the trip and about you learn so much from each other, but I can tell you one thing about this trip that I think you should take away. I learned more about American history on this trip than I've ever learned in elementary, middle, or high school. Like, I promise you, if you go on this trip, you'll learn so much more. Like, this trip gave me a perspective I didn't even know I needed. So I really recommend it. So now one announcement I want to make is after this, there's a reception upstairs in the reading room, but we're going to go into the Q&A section if anyone has any questions for any of the panelists about any part we've been to, our experience.
And I'll bring the mic out because we're live streaming. And Omar didn't mention the reception. I've been trying to get his attention. We have fresh desserts. What else do we have upstairs? Pizza. So don't leave. I mean, I don't know why. I mean, these guys are trying to hide it from you. I think that's why they weren't mentioning it, but we have enough for everyone. So any questions, I'll bring the mic out to you, and then I'll have to run the mic back just for the live stream. And then I think one back here. Oh, yeah.
I wanted to ask you guys, what do you guys think about the UF's racial history and about all of the, all of the stuff that happened with the Black Cultural Institute and about the founding of the American Studies program?
So what do you think about UF's Racial History and Black Studies Institute? It's a lot.
I guess. So if no one has an answer, I have an answer. I guess I'm just be honest. UF is not a great place for minority students. UF does not really show us that they care. They don't provide enough resources. You know, they tell us, you have IBC, you have La Casita, isn't that enough? It's like, we need that stuff. But then when white students are like, why don't we have a house? It's like, because you don't need this. This campus is for you. It's not for the rest of us. So I guess I want to say UF culture, UF, like for African American, Latinx, any minority students isn't great. And I'm really hoping that they'll provide us more resources. Let's be honest, they probably won't, because this is a white institute. This is a PWI. I don't know if that answers your question. Oh.
Okay, so just to add on to what Omar said, historically, the University of Florida was not built for me. It was built as an all-white male institution. And it wasn't built for Latinx folk, it wasn't built for Black folk. And then it also wasn't built for students who are disabled. This campus was not built for us, but we're here. You know, we have to acknowledge our history, that we've come a long way, but there is a lot that this university as an institution can do for Latinx, minority students, disabled students, first-generation students, low-income students, all of that. Everything that falls into that umbrella, that category. I can't name them all off the top of my head, but I'm trying to be as inclusive as possible. This institution is very interesting. And I think if you read books like African Americans at UF, which you can find at our library or online, and other resources, you'll unravel that history.
Just being honest, UF think it's slick. Like, it's not. Like, we know what you're doing, especially when you study systematic oppression. UF definitely has a hand in it. Again, this year was the lowest enrollment of Black students specifically. And you have to make some sort of correlation that the higher that UF is going in the ranking, you realize the number of Black students is decreasing. You can even, UF just has a role in many things. So like that question can be picked apart in so many ways. You even have to look at UF's hand in Gainesville as well. East Gainesville specifically, like why only certain or it's very limited of Black students who are born and raised in Gainesville are not really coming here at UF. UF just has a lot of problems when it deals with diversity in general. For example, when you look at the brochures, they like to have, a few of the Black students to make it look diverse, but is it really though? There's just a lot of issues. I can go on and on, but okay.
Sorry, Julian. The one plug I want to make is we do have a Black and Latinx class at UF, Samuel Proctor sponsored, so look into that if you really want to learn about the history.
All right, we'll try to get a few more questions before we adjourn. I think someone, a question?
One now. Okay. Hey, so you mentioned Aishwarya specifically about seeing like the continuation into today, and a couple of you guys like talked about a couple of different ways that like you see just kind of like discrepancies. So are any of you like driven to or currently doing something about like the current or future of what you saw on this trip?
Thank you.
Could you clarify the question? Like, what is it that we're doing now with the information and things like that? Well, I can say that this was before the trip, but even more so after. I'm incredibly involved in my community back in Southwest Florida, both at the Southwest Florida Historical Society and the Lee County Black History Society. And I think the trip really reaffirms how much people need to be involved in their local histories. Because, again, I think Omar said it best when he was talking about, he's like, I can't believe like we haven't learned about these figures before. And the thing is just they aren't going to be covered in national history classes because they're trying to teach a history from a national perspective. And if people don't have the drive to go out and learn about their community histories, then they're never going to learn about these things. And I think this is especially important as like even in like the naming of things. I always thought it was interesting that like for example the main bus depot here in Gainesville is named after Rosa Parks, which I'm not going to trash Rosa Parks. If Rosa Parks were alive, she'd kick my ass. But there are also individuals who were extremely important, like Reverend C.K. Steele in Tallahassee, who we went to his church, his congregation as it is now at Bethel Baptist Church, and he led the Tallahassee bus boycott. So I think going on these trips, it kind of reminds us that we need to focus more. We still need to highlight national figures, but we also need to highlight state and local figures as well so that people can learn about them more easily without having to go to UF to be a history major and then study this stuff for a living.
Hi, yeah, this trip definitely motivated me more to look into criminal justice reform, and I'm actually working on a conference dedicated to it in February with the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, and we're gonna bring together stakeholders in the field from nonprofits, state legislators, judges, to bring about their perspective, and then students will get to create like public policy proposals. So that's just like one form of what I'm doing, and I'm sure a bunch of us are all going in different directions, but hopefully in the general good direction. Yeah.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes.
So earlier y'all mentioned, and I think it was Monticello, there were the lynching monuments, and I don't remember who mentioned it, but one of you all mentioned that like in order for I guess the county to get like their monument back or something, they would have to do like a reconciliation process. And I was just like, I love the idea of that. And I think you said that like they're not just gonna get it back for clout. So I'm like, yeah. But can you like kind of expand on what that process would look like if you do know, or kind of like more on that?
So the question about the Equal Justice Initiative, the lynching memorial that a lot of the students have talked about, and when you walk in, first of all, how many of you here have went to Montgomery to see? So a few of us have, but usually you start at the museum from slavery to mass incarceration, and then you go to the memorial, the lynching memorial, for peace and justice, and you see the pillars that students have been talking about represent, each pillar is a county in the South, and the names on the pillars, some of them are identified if Equal Justice Initiative was able to identify the names of the individuals lynched. But in some cases, especially the anti-Black pogroms, so many people were murdered that it's been impossible to identify individuals, and so they'll say unknown. Now, the idea that Equal Justice Initiative has is that counties throughout the South will step up, take responsibility, take ownership of this history of their own county, and create a plan, a community-based plan to accept the marker, to place that marker in their county in a very public place, not just an out-of-way place, but a center place, and to create educational curriculum around that, so that young people and old people and everyone in between will actually go and learn about that. So to my knowledge, so far, not a single county has actually been able to claim their marker yet. But we do have folks in Alachua County. I wonder if, Kathleen, Jack, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you're working on this, right? Do you want to say a few things? Because we have some really, and then Mr. Nelson too.
I'm Kathleen Pagan. I'm a comprehensive planner for Alachua County, and I'm the staff liaison to the County Historical Commission. And we are actively, as a group, discussing this. Jackie Chung from County EO is here with me today, and Joelle Laguerre from IT. We're working on a website that will inform the community about this history in Alachua County. And moving forward, I can't give a time frame, but we are working on this. The County Commission directed this in a motion in 2018, so we've been working on this.
And Mr. Nelson, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, if I may. First of all, thank you for inviting me, Dr. Ortiz, and a number of the students. I've had a chance to meet you in Monticello and enjoyed your comments about your experiences. For Germany, as a military person, I was at Hanau, which is about 17 kilometers from Frankfurt. And of course, I had an opportunity to play football while I was in Germany, and I toured all over many different places I was able to go because I too wanted to make certain that I was involved in history. Everything that you talked about, I am a part of history. I made history in Florida. I share with you quickly one thing that Dr. Ortiz, I'm involved in a project right now. Monday night, I was before the Jefferson County School Board requesting to get a track trophy. I was a member of the track team in 1964 when we went to the family relays, met Bob Hayes. We had about 6 guys running the 100-yard dash in the 9.4s and the 9.5 area. And of course, I ran the mile in about 4:33. But Bob Hayes actually, as you know, Bob Hayes was in the 1964 Olympics. And he came out and congratulated all of us for our accomplishments. There's a trophy that I requested the school board on Monday night to give to me because it's at the high school that I graduated from as an honor graduate. It's sitting there deteriorating. But what I have taken on is a project in Jefferson County. There are black church schools that I'm trying to preserve with Florida A&M University, Dr. Sandra Thompson. And ironically, there are 3 African-American members on that board. I'm past chair of the Board of County Commissioners. In 2011, I came to Archer to look at a project that they had there with Commissioner Roberta Lopez, took that plan back to Jefferson County. The school board voted it down 5-0. We were going to get $1.5 million to restore the school that I graduated from, the Old Howard Academy. And here it is, 2019. On Monday night, I'm asking for a trophy to go back to get, because I'm going to preserve all of that history. So to hear you talk about your experiences really is a welcoming, what I call, it makes my soul cringe because of what you're learning I lived through. I graduated in 1966. Jack Youngblood was at Jefferson, came here, All-American at University of Florida, went on to the Los Angeles Rams. I was a star athlete at the segregated Howard Academy. So the key part about it is we all have a lot of work to do. We've got to make certain the experiences like myself, I have to demand. So to close it out, they did not vote on that. I called the superintendent yesterday morning and demanded that I be on the agenda 2 weeks from now to make certain that we get and preserve that history. So all of you and your experiences that you're getting through the oral history program, which I just contributed $200. As you know, every year I try to make certain monetarily I will continue to support this program. Bless you, continue to work hard and be successful in your careers. I'm retired, 71 years old now, but I still do a lot of work. Thank you.
All right, do we want to do maybe closing thoughts and adjourn for refreshments?
Start from the back. Work away up.
Why? Why would you give it to the well, no, Aishwarya is also a history major, but thank you all for coming. It really means a lot to us that you were willing to sit through this and hear, well, particularly me, but others ramble about their experiences on the trip. I enjoyed my time. If there are any students here that have time next summer to go on the trip, I highly recommend that you apply. If for any reason you get to listen to Dr. Ortiz's playlist, which is absolutely amazing. And I'll pass it off to Alvin.
Yes, also thank you for coming, anyone, and thank you for supporting those kind of trips or initiatives, let it be financially or non-financially. It has been so far the highlight of my first year in the US, I would say. What I've learned here, totally unrelated to my studies, but nevertheless the highlight of my trip. And thank you.
And also for those of you who are not in the line of historical work or things like that, I'm actually pre-med. So kind of like off of your question, a lot of what I learned on this trip really solidified how I would like to present myself as a healthcare provider in the future, and also the type of work that I would want to do in the medical field. So whatever discipline that you are from, definitely apply. This is invaluable information that will definitely help you in any place that you end up going.
Yes, just saying thank you for coming. I highly recommend, especially the students to do it. I didn't regret it. Like, I would definitely do this again if I had the chance. If you don't have time, you can just get your friends and do your own trip, do your own version. you never stop learning. We're always learning, especially about Black history. There's always something to, to be revealed. So again, definitely recommend.
Thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you all for being here. If you want to learn more about the history of UF or just African Americans in general or LDAP or Latinx histories, come to the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Go online and look at what the interviews that we already have and, the work that has already been put out by the countless interns and people that have worked so hard to make sure that this history is accessible. Additionally, I want to end with the quote that Dr. Ortiz said while on this trip, which is, how can people have a sense of self if they don't know their history? So I encourage you all to learn about your own history ethnically, also in your own counties and states, learn that local history because you could be a part of an initiative that, completely changes your whole perspective of the world.
On this trip, I learned such a dense amount of history in 1 week. Definitely one of the highlights of my life, I would say. And I'm really grateful for the experience and Dr. Ortiz for leading the way.
So yeah, it was a great trip, amazing experience. Loved hanging out with y'all. Thank you, Dr. Ortiz. Thank you, Miss Deborah. Thank you, Miss Tamara. Thank you, Sam and Grace for coordinating it. It's a trip we need. You need trips like these. You don't understand history until you go on a trip like this. I would love to have a trip like this for Latinx people if we could do that one day. But yeah, so I guess that's it for us. I don't know if Dr. Ortiz wants to say anything else.
Well, just to echo everything, I invite everyone to look at the courses we're offering in the spring. We always love to have volunteers, friends, fellow travelers in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. I want to acknowledge our dear colleagues in the Bob Graham Center for Public Service who have been perennial sponsors and supporters and make what we do possible. I also want to take a moment of silence to acknowledge my dear colleague and longtime director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, who just recently passed away, Professor David Colburn. Thank you. And I mentioned Dr. Colburn because he was one of my mentors and guides, and really in the early years of the Mississippi Freedom Project, really helped us kind of chart out the trajectory of the project. Well, now, and again, for folks who joining us on live stream, I apologize because you can't really be here to enjoy the desserts and the wonderful food, but I invite you to adjourn upstairs. We have elevator right here, or stairs. There are restrooms directly back this way. But please join us and let's continue the conversation over some refreshments. Thank you very much again to our panelists. All right.
Thank you. Exhausted.
Justin? Oh, I got it!
Avoid doing the meetings on the Sundays, so you're like... Have another example.